Dr. Jonathan W. England. How was it?
Good, Tyler. Going well. How are you?
That's my name.
Did you have a good week?
Yeah, it was a great week. Had a lot of great discussions with people about our podcast with Paul Reeve. I thought that went really well. And I'm super excited for this week's because I think it's going to be just as interesting and just as informative.
Yeah, I'm excited for this week's too. We have Dr. Patrick Mason on with us to talk about some fascinating subjects in Mormon history. So it'll be really good.
You didn't call me out. I just guessed on your middle initial. Is it W?
No, but I thought you were going off of the subtitle that I put in.
W, yes.
Yeah.
I would have, but it's too long. I can't even read it. There's ... I don't know how it ends. So, John, why do they keep letting him in?
Yeah.
Anyway, good stuff. All right. Yeah, I was super excited because you'd mentioned, those who are listening, I'm sure have read the title. We have Dr. Patrick Mason with us today, and I was super excited when you informed me that we were going to have a chance to interview him and listen to what he has to say.
Yeah. Patrick is one of the foremost scholars on Mormon history, not the most, the foremost scholar. He's very knowledgeable. He's written a lot, done a ton of research. He speaks all over the country. And currently he's the Leonard J. Arrington Chair of Mormon History and Culture at Utah State University. He was my professor at Claremont, which was great for me, and I'm sure it was equally great for him. But
sure. We'll ask him when he We'll ask him when he gets here. See how.
No, we don't need to ask him. I think it's just a given, and okay. I'm sure he gets tired of that question all the time. Like, what's it like to work with John England? He's tired of it, so we don't need to.
All right.
We don't need to get into that.
We'll spare. We may spare him. Yeah. It may come up just casually. Like I'm pretty smooth at putting questions in like that.
You are. You're a very smooth guy. That's what everyone says.
That's what they tell me.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, was that enough introduction? Should we bring him in with us?
Okay, I'll add a few more things. So yeah, he's the Leonard J. Arrington Chair of Mormon Studies or Mormon History and Culture at Utah State. Before that, he was the Chair of Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University. Some of his publications include Proclaim Peace, The Restoration's Answer to an Age of Conflict, Mormonism and Violence, The Battles of Zion, What is Mormonism? A Student's Introduction, and The Mormon Menace, Violence and Anti-Mormonism in the Postbellum South. So as you can see, he's very well versed on all of this stuff. And today we're going to be talking about Mormonism and violence, specifically within the context of the Missouri settlements.
Sounds interesting. Well, without further ado, welcome, Patrick.
Hey, guys. It's good to be here.
We're excited to have you. Thanks so much for joining us. This is a pleasure I've been waiting for ever since I knew John knew you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the invitation. And yeah, to the earlier point, I mean, it's a bit of a burden having been associated with John, because I mean, just like the questions are just kind of nonstop. I've run out of superlatives to describe that experience, and so yeah. So if we can kind of avoid that, I mean, I just talk about it all the time.
I understand. I tend to have to apologize for John quite frequently myself. So. I get where you're coming from. So, Patrick, are you able to hear John right now?
No, I think John's frozen.
All right. Well, we'll kind of stall slightly while he gets back with us. But can you tell us a little bit about maybe your background, your experiences? What got you to be on such a prestigious podcast with us today?
Absolutely. So yeah, so I'm a historian. I got my PhD in American history from University of Notre Dame, and my focus was on religious history more broadly. but based on my dissertation, and which became my first book that John mentioned, The Mormon Menace, I just became more and more interested, more and more focused in my research and teaching on Mormon history. And so I've done a lot of different things, interested in lots of different things. I'm a bit of a dilettante that way. I don't just focus on one thing, but maybe the consistent theme that I keep coming back to are questions of violence, both the violence that has been done against Latter-day Saints throughout history, but also the violence that Latter-day Saints themselves committed against other people as well. And then as much as I'm interested in violence, I'm more interested in peace. I'm more interested in us transforming and getting past that violence. And so that was my most recent book.
Oh, great. That's cool. I think John's on his way to join us again. But so today, what we'd like to do on our podcast is we like to kind of focus in on a single source of the starting point that's contemporary to the time, and also telling of what goes on. I think this week, and I say I think because John's the mastermind behind all this, is DNC Section 98. Can you just very briefly kind of introduce us to what is the context around Section 98 and why might we be interested in talking about it?
Yeah, so this is a revelation that Joseph Smith receives in early August of 1833. And what's been going on up to that point, Joseph Smith is in Kirtland, Ohio, but as you know, there was the settlements in Missouri, which had been designated as the land of Zion, especially Jackson County and Independence being the center place of that. And so as of this point, as of the summer of 1833, there were about 1,200 Mormons in Jackson County, give or take, and they represented about a third of the total population. So it's important to keep in mind that Jackson County is literally like the western border of the United States. It is the frontier. It is very lightly settled. Native Americans have been removed from that area, and so they live just over the line in quote unquote Indian territory. And so this is the edge of white settlement. And so Mormons are coming in. They're not the very first to arrive, but they're close. I mean, whites have only been settling in this area for a few years up to that point. And so as the Mormons come, they're purchasing more and more land. They're very open about the fact. They start a newspaper and they openly declare that this land has been given to them by God, that this is the place where they're going to build the New Jerusalem. And there's not really much place for non-Mormons in that vision, in that plan, at least the way that the Mormons normally talk about it. And so we start to see by the summer of 1833 some pretty significant tension between Mormons and non-Mormons, to the point that in July of 1833, the non-Mormons have had enough. They're threatened, I think, by the growing political power of the Mormons. And before it gets any more, they want to do something about it. And what they want to do is get rid of the Mormons. They want to expel them from the county and rid themselves of this political threat.
Oh, great. Well, great. Thanks for
Yeah,
saying
it's not a happy
it's a great
story.
setup. It's a great setup, not great the status. So before we dive into this, the Mormon pioneers there, could you give us a little more context around what's going on in the early 19th century in America? Specifically, do we have any stats, figures, or anecdotal evidence that gives us an idea on how prevalent violence was at that time?
Yeah, and that's a great question. It's a really important question for understanding this. I think sometimes when Latter-day Saints talk about their history, especially this early history where there is so much persecution, so much violence, there's a way that we can tell that history like that the Mormons are the center of the story, and it's like this peaceful nation that everybody hates Mormons. In fact, it was a very, very violent country. The 1830s were a tremendously tumultuous era in American history for lots of different reasons. A lot of it has to do around slavery and around race. A lot of it has to do with Western settlement. It has to do with other issues as well. And it's not just when it comes to religious religious violence, it's not just about Mormons. There's a lot of anti-Catholic violence. So in fact, at about the same time, just a few months later, there's a convent that's burned to the ground in Boston. There are riots between Catholics and Protestants in different cities around the country. And so in the year, just as an example, so we're going to be talking about 1833, but 2 years later in 1835, there are almost 150 riots all around the country. Think about that. You know, if there's like 1 or 2 riots a year in this country, like it makes national headlines. Or think about even in the summer of 2020, after George Floyd's murder, you know, there were a handful of riots in different cities around the country. But in 1835, 150 riots all around the country, most of them during the summertime. And so this is a very violent period. Vigilantism is a widely accepted norm. Vigilantism is simply the fancy word for ordinary citizens taking the law into their own hands, usually with the feeling that the normal, the police forces and judges and magistrates and marshals, that's not enough. That normal law enforcement is not enough to take care of things, and so citizens have to take things into their own hands. And remember, this is only like 50 years after the Revolution. And so there's still this spirit. They oftentimes call it the spirit of 76, where they say, hey, the whole point of the American Revolution is that if ordinary citizens feel like government is either tyrannical or not doing what it's supposed to be doing, citizens should take things into their own hands. So a lot of these vigilantes, they don't feel like they're being anti-American. They don't feel like they're being anti-law. They're saying this is the most American thing that you can do. When the majority feels like a minority is oppressing them or doing something obnoxious, the majority has a right under democracy to flex its muscles. And again, if we can't do that politically, if we can't do that peacefully, then we might have to take other means. And that's where vigilantes come in.
Gotcha. So with regards to the early church, then, would they have a similar similar perspective on violence? What was the policy against violence in the early church days?
Yeah, so eventually Mormons will take on a very similar idea, but it's only after 1833. Prior to this, now, of course, the church is really young. You know, the church is only 3 years old at this point. But prior to this, from 1830 to 1833, it's really, we can describe Latter-day Saints basically as pacifists. They were not violent. They did not take up arms. Even in the instances where there was violence done against them, they did not respond in kind. So you think about the famous instance where Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon were mobbed and almost murdered the previous year in 1832. Some Latter-day Saints kind of reached for their guns, but their leaders said, no, stand down. That's not the way we respond. In fact, John Corrill, who would go on to write a history of the church, he was a member of the church at the time. He would eventually leave the church, I think, in 1838, in association with the Missouri violence of that period. But John Corrill says that up until this time, Latter-day Saints, that they followed the Savior's injunction to turn the other cheek. And so even when they were subject to persecutions, to mob violence, to property being destroyed, Latter-day Saints did not respond in kind. So that's the situation we're at in 1833. The Latter-day Saints, they don't really describe themselves as pacifists, but their actions would say that that's how they respond.
Gotcha. I want to welcome our second guest, Mr. John England, to the doctor. Excuse me. I think you've been demoted down to Mr. Welcome back, John.
Yeah, sorry.
No
yeah,
worries.
thanks for having me. What did I miss?
We pretty much covered it. We're done.
Yep, we're done. We're done. Thank you.
Nuts.
Now we just talked about kind of how early church members would have been, what they would have been taught in regards to violence, and Patrick shared with us that really they were pacifists at the time, kind of turn the other cheek or bury the arms type mentality.
Oh, okay.
And we learned that I would be awesome at this if you were not here.
Yeah,
that's what we learned collectively.
I already knew that. Everyone knew that. Secret's out. Now you're in the club, Tyler. But that's great. I really wanted to hear all that, so I'll have to go back and listen to this, which should boost our listenership. So that's good.
Up to 4.5.
Yep. Great. So, Patrick, I know that you wrote that one of the church's responses to violence was to build Zion. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Was that an explicit result or explicit response to violence at the church level, or was it more of a natural byproduct of what was happening?
Yeah, and so we use the phrase "build Zion" today to just kind of think about like building up the church or living righteously or preparing the earth for the second coming, sending out missionaries. That's we kind of think about it in pretty spiritual terms today. But in the early 1830s, building Zion really meant building a city called Zion. It was literal, it was tangible, it had a material quality to it. And so those people, those saints who were settling in Western Missouri, they literally believed they were building an actual city that would be called the City of Zion, also known as the New Jerusalem, that would welcome Jesus back. So it's not that the building Zion was a response to violence per se. It was simply their mission. It was the cause of the church. It is what they had been called to do. But when they did receive persecution, and we should say up until 1833, it's mostly fairly low level persecution, with the exception, again, this 1832 mobbing of Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. They very nearly lost their lives. That was serious stuff. There were a few other serious instances, but on the whole, it had been kind of low level stuff up to this point. Lots of hostility, lots of opposition. And they simply kind of put their heads down and they said, our job is not to respond. Our job is not to be distracted by that. Our job is to build the New Jerusalem, because, and we can't underscore this enough, that the earliest Mormons absolutely, genuinely, fervently believed that Jesus was coming back like anytime. Today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. It was not some indefinite future, some vague thing that might happen generations later. They believed that Jesus, when they said Latter-day Saints, they meant really last day saints. And so everything they did was with that understanding that Jesus was coming back and they were going to act accordingly. So they didn't have to get so involved in politics. They didn't have to get distracted by some of these other things because they had a job to do. And Jesus was coming back anytime.
Your mouth, you would make a great mime, John, but unfortunately this is a podcast. So
shoot, sorry. I actually I won an award for miming in high school, but that's another thing. So what did Zion look like to them? You mentioned it was a physical, literal city that they wanted to build. Was it exclusive to just followers of Joseph Smith? Was it exclusive to Americans? What kind of people did they want to bring into Zion?
Yeah, the whole idea of Zion is that they would issue an invitation to everybody. From the very beginning, the Restoration had a universal message that they were supposed to preach the gospel to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And this is why missionaries start going out immediately. It's amazing how quickly the movement becomes international. The very first mission is to Native Americans, who they believe were Lamanites. There were African Americans, people of African descent, who were in the church within just months of its founding, and so the early message is very universal. And of course, that history will get complicated over time. But that initial vision. I mean, the Book of Mormon is very clear about this. The gospel message is supposed to go to everybody. Revelations were very clear about this. And, we typically do think about Zion just being for members of the church. Certainly there was a lot of call, to come out of Babylon, to gather the elect. But it's really interesting. An earlier revelation that Joseph Smith had received, we have this now as section 45 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So this was March of 1831. The church wasn't quite a year old. the revelations had just come about gathering in Missouri and building Zion. These were some of the prophecies that eventually led people to gather to Missouri. And it's interesting, starting in verse 66, it says, it shall be called the New Jerusalem, a land of peace, a city of refuge, a place of safety for the saints of the Most High. So there's a sense that, okay, this is for the saints, so it's for church members. But then it goes on to say in verse 68, it shall come to pass among the wicked that every man, every person that will not take his sword against his neighbor must needs flee unto Zion for safety. And there shall be gathered unto it out of every nation under heaven, and it shall be the only people that shall not be at war one with another. So it's really interesting. So on the one hand, clearly to gather from every nation under heaven. So it's a universal message, but it's not just church members. It says that anybody who won't take their sword against their neighbor will gather into Zion. Because of course the prophecies about the last days, the prophecies about the end times included all this violence and destruction and wars and rumors and wars and so forth. And this prophecy said that anybody who didn't want a part of that, anybody who wanted safety and peace and refuge was welcome in Zion. So at least my reading of this, and we would see this play out in interesting ways over the coming years, is that anybody was welcome in Zion. Of course, the preference was for them to be baptized and become a member of the church. But Zion was fundamentally a place that it was going to be a refuge for people from all over the world who were fleeing the violence of the last days.
That's fascinating. So it sounds like really the only requirement to join Zion was just to be a peacekeeper.
I mean, in those verses, right? I mean, there are other prophecies too that obviously they talk about repentance and accepting Christ and so forth. Mm-hmm. But at least in section 45 in that revelation, that's how it frames it, and it's riffing off of what will become Moses 7, the Enoch revelation that Joseph Smith is getting at about the same time. He's clearly thinking about this and these ideas about a city, about city building, about people building. And the exact same dynamic is on display in Moses chapter 7 as well. You've got Enoch and his people, the people who listen to him, and then you've got a very violent world on the outside. But Zion is the one place that you can find safety and peace. And what qualified you to be there was a willingness to gather to this place of peace.
Interesting. And so section 45 was written in 1830.
I think John froze again, and Tyler, you're on mute.
The show is yours, Patrick. Take over.
I'm just going to monologue from this point.
This is,
oh my gosh!
I think John's back. John's back now. We're good.
I mean, I am a professor. I mean, what I do, I just profess. So I'll just talk until somebody stops me. So.
And it would be so much better if we just kept myself and John on mute the entire time anyway.
Yeah. This is the kind of high functioning production we have going here. So, but yeah, Patrick. So it sounds like section 45 was written in 1831, correct?
Right.
So at this time in 1831, is there more of an emphasis on building the city of Zion or building the church? Are the two exclusive to each other, or are they conflated together? Is the church Zion, or how is that viewed by the body of the church?
Yeah, well, excellent. Excuse me, that's an excellent question. The church is not Zion. Zion is a city that will be built, that will be the New Jerusalem, and will receive Jesus. Now, Zion, the definition of Zion will get looser, and you'll have multiple definitions over time. Even the Revelations and Joseph Smith's own teaching will talk about it variously. At one point, he says Zion is all of North and South America. Right. And so, but then others will, and then section 97, I think it is, that says Zion is the pure in heart. So you have lots of different definitions of Zion, but originally, in Latter-day Saint theology, Zion is a city that will be the New Jerusalem, that would be prepared to receive Jesus, and then the definitions expand from there.
Okay, great. So I know that there were other sort of religious utopian societies or an attempt, right, from a bunch of different groups to build utopian societies. Were they also as inclusive as this was meant to be?
Many were. You're exactly right. I mean, this is a time of just tremendous experimentation, a lot of innovation, not just in American religion, but other places as well. And a lot of these movements they're sort of playing with kind of standard social and political and gendered and economic boundaries. They and other movements. So for instance, Methodism is a few decades older than Mormonism, but initially Methodism was extremely inclusive. It included slaves. It was really countercultural in the way that it included enslaved peoples. And you had other kind of more radical communities at this time, like the Oneida community that was practicing open marriage. And so a lot of these groups, you had abolitionist groups that were really challenging American politics around ideas of race. And now we look back and we see abolitionists as heroes. In the 1830s, they were not heroes. They were villains for most Americans because they were absolutely on the radical edge of American society. And so they were, playing with ideas of like breaking down racial differences and so forth. So there were some other religious groups and political groups and social groups that had a universal message like this. But Mormonism, when in the early 1830s, if you're a religious organization that admits people of every race on basically equal footing, that is an extraordinarily radical act in the 1830s. Now, Mormonism would get less radical over time when it creates racial distinctions, especially in 1852. But in the early 1830s, the universalism of Mormonism really is pretty radical.
So this is what you get when you deal with the Stone Rolling podcast. Actually, we've never had freezing this bad before, so my apologies, Patrick.
Yeah, well, he needs to pay the internet bill, I guess, is the moral to the story.
That's true. We'll send a few dollars his way so he can get that all.
Think of a donation among your listeners so that
great plug. Yeah, if you want to hear John's voice again, please throw a few dollars towards him. No, could you tell us a little bit about what's going on in Missouri then? Just to kind of know where the Missouri. How does Missouri put the accent in the right syllable? How does Missouri kind of play into this this environment where the church is looking to build this utopian society? Obviously, there's people already there. Can maybe expound on that a little?
Yeah, no, it's a really important part of the history. So Missouri is a brand new state at this point. It had just come in to the United States as a state a few years earlier. People, everybody who took American history learned about the Missouri Compromise at some point. This is one of the early compromises between northern states and southern states. Northerners who are generally anti-slavery, they're not really abolitionists and they don't really believe in racial equality, but they don't want slavery to expand, whereas Southerners who do want slavery to expand. So beginning in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, you get this series of compromises that are trying to hold the nation together and letting in free states and slave states and coming up with all kinds of intricate ways to do that. Eventually, of course, it breaks down in the Civil War. But Missouri is admitted to the United States as a slave state. And that's really important because what does that mean for the people who are going to be settling there? They're mostly going to be Southerners. And so states that are admitted as free states, it's generally Northerners who move into those areas. States that are admitted as slave states are generally it's Southerners who move into that. Mostly white Southerners, but sometimes they bring enslaved people with them as well. So that's the character of Missouri, and it's really important. And Missouri, because of all the controversies, the debates over slavery are very alive in Missouri. It's not like the compromise just settles everything in 1820. All it does is just kick the bucket down the road. And so it's mostly Southerners who are settling this area, whereas most of the Mormon converts are from the north. There are some Mormon converts from the south, but at this time in the early 1830s, most of them are from New York, Pennsylvania, the places where Mormonism was and had been established. So right out of the gates, you get this cultural conflict between Mormons, who are mostly Northerners, mostly don't have slaves, versus Southerners who just have a different worldview and a different set of politics and a different culture.
Cool. Yeah, the introduction to Section 98 doesn't give much context behind what's going on between the church and Missourians. Basically, it just says that a mob destroyed church property and tarred and feathered church members. Could you give a little more context of what's going on between the church and the Missourians that live there?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, so this conflict starts to build over the previous 2 years, and by the time, again, it's just important to note that as of the summer of 1833, Mormons constituted about a third of the county population. Now, and they're growing. People are moving in quickly, and the non-Mormons can see that, and so they know that very quickly, if they don't do anything about it, Mormons are because the population is so low. I mean, there's only like 5,000 people in the whole county. And so they know if just a few hundred more Mormons come into this place, they're going to be the majority. And once that happens, they'll control local politics. They'll be able to elect their own people. And basically the non-Mormons won't have a voice at that point. And so they feel like that they've got to do something preventatively or preemptively to stop that from happening. So in July of 1833, the leading members of the non-Mormon community, and so here's another thing. Sometimes we think about mobs and vigilantes as just like these ruffians, or like, these like, just people who are not educated, kind of on the margins, or kind of these rough characters. In early America, vigilante movements were oftentimes led by the leading citizens, and that was the case here. So it was not just kind of the rabble, but it was people who were legal, law enforcement leaders, political leaders, business leaders, economic leaders of the community who are not Mormon, who they gather the non-Mormons together. They have meetings. This is another thing. It's not just spontaneous violence. They actually have meetings, and they approach the Mormons and they said, "You've got to get out of here. You're not welcome here anymore." And again, this is early America, where the majority rules. Minorities don't have many rights. And so the majority comes and says, "We want you out of here." The Mormons say no. And so the non-Mormons go back and they actually draft a manifesto. It's published in the history of the church as the Manifesto of the Mob, or the Mob Manifesto. And it's several paragraphs long, and it outlines what all the things that they don't like about the Mormons, all their complaints about the Mormons. It's actually an amazing document. It says, so it criticizes them for their religious beliefs, their pretended revelations and so forth. It says that they're poor, that they're backward, that they're kind of the dregs of society. That's not entirely true. But then the two most significant things that it says, and I think really the heart of the conflict, is it talks about Mormons being open to bringing in free blacks into the territory. Now, remember, Missouri is a slave state, but it was possible for free blacks to live there as well. People who had either been emancipated from slavery, or who had never been slaves at all. And in fact, Mormons, the Mormon newspaper, the Evening and Morning Star, W.W. Phelps, had published an editorial earlier where he said that the Mormon message was open to everybody, right? And he included free blacks in that. And as soon as he publishes that, it just blows up. And the Missourians, again, who are pro-slavery, mostly from the South, they go crazy. And they say, look, these Mormons are radicals. They're abolitionists. They want to bring free blacks into the territory. They want to free the slaves. They want to preach to the slaves. this is terrible. Again, we look back on it and we say, huzzah for racial equality. It's not that way in the 1830s. And so that's one of their complaints. Now, W.W. Phelps is actually going to write an op-ed immediately after that saying, whoa, no, I didn't mean that. Hey, we're not going to tamper with slaves. We're not going to bring free blacks in. So he backtracks, but the damage is already done. And then the last thing that they say in this manifesto is basically they're going to come and just take everything over. They've said that God has given them this land. They believe that they have a divine right to this land. So they're going to come in, they're going to take over, and we're going to lose our land, our property, our rights, everything. And so they have this manifesto of the mob, and it's signed. It's not anonymous. It's signed by these leading members of the community. They put their names on it. And then they come and they give it to Edward Partridge, who's the local bishop, and to other leaders of the church, and basically say, here's our complaints against you. You've got to leave. And the Mormons come back and they say, well, give us a few months. And they say, no, you've got, I think they say like 24 hours, or it's I forget exactly, but it's really, really short. They're like, no, you've got to leave immediately. Or you've got to make the decision, the commitment to leave immediately. And then you've got to be out of here within a few weeks. The Mormons say no. And so at that point, that's when the mob forms, and they come and they tar and feather Edward Partridge, who's the bishop of the church, and then another man. They burn down, they demolish the press where the Mormon newspaper is being published. And they start to demolish and tear down houses and so forth. And so that's what's going on in late July 1831. And immediately the Mormons send word to Kirtland, because obviously, there's no phones, there's no telegraph, there's no way that Joseph Smith would know what was going on. So they send somebody to go as fast as they can to Kirtland. And so they arrive in Kirtland and report to Joseph Smith what's going on in Jackson County. And that's the setting for then Joseph Smith receiving this revelation.
Okay. So based on that telling, it sounds very much like the Mormons are the victims here. They're moving in. The Missourians who live there say, get out. They tar and feather. They attack them. Was this a one-way offensive at this point, or was there any retaliation, or maybe before that any offensive or threats coming from the Mormon pioneers towards the Missourians?
Yeah, great question. At this point, it's pretty one way, especially in terms of the violence. That won't be true 5 years later in 1838. But it's true here in 1833. The Mormons do not respond with violence. They do not take up arms. They do not defend themselves at this point in July and August of 1833. Now, are the Mormons blameless? Well, that just depends on your perspective, right? I mean, the Mormons had come in and said, God gave us this land, it's ours. I mean, so they were obnoxious, to be sure. I mean, imagine if the shoe's on the other foot. Imagine if you're one of these non-Mormon settlers, and then this strange new religious group that nobody's ever heard of comes from New York, comes from Ohio, and they say, we have a prophet who's received revelations that said Jesus is coming here, right? And so this land is ours. Obviously, that just sounds crazy. And so Mormons were not. So Mormons don't have any blame in terms of like using any violence or anything like that. But clearly their offenses were their claims to the land, which they said came from God. And then again, this kind of their messaging around race, which really originally had suggested that they were open to blacks being part of the movement. So from a Missourian standpoint, those things are, that's the problem. That's enough, right? To say we don't want these people in our communities. Nobody's making any claims that the Mormons are coming in and forcing them out of their homes or anything like that. But it's just, this is an unwanted presence. We don't want this. This is NIMBYism, not in my backyard, right? Fine, you Mormons can take your crazy ideas somewhere else. But this is the majority getting together and saying, no, we don't want these people in our community.
Yeah, this is all really interesting. And so we're talking about 1833 here. And Patrick, you've written that Smith's revelations in the first 2 years after the organization of the church featured an apocalyptic tone and perspective. Now, and you've mentioned this already, that the idea was that Christ's coming was just right around the corner. But then starting, you further right, beginning in 1833, the revelations transitioned to a more accommodationist position, allowing for negotiation, even friendship, with secular political structures. I don't want to deviate too much from our topic, but can you tell us a little bit more about this? Was there a distinguishable shift away from an apocalyptic ideal to one of accommodation? Like, did Joseph Smith get with other leaders and say, hey, look, we're going to shift more towards, getting along with what's going on right now? Or was it just sort of a natural occurrence?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it is really important that there's a lot of really good scholarship on Mormon apocalypticism or millennialism. And when we use those terms, it's simply just the expectation that that the end times is near, that we live in the last days, and that Jesus is coming very soon, like the apocalypse, the second coming is imminent. And so scholars call that apocalypticism or millennialism. And the best scholars on this are Grant Underwood, published a great book called The Millenarian World of Early Mormonism. And then Christopher Blythe recently published a book called Terrible Revolution. I might be getting the title wrong, but it's terrific as well. I think we do start to see a shift, and it's precisely as a result of this of what happens, and we see it beginning in section 98, because prior to this, the revelations occasionally talk about like the nations, but when they talk about the nations, they're really just talking about all the people around the world, right? Take the gospel to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. They're not talking about like sovereign states, political entities. The early revelations don't really care about politics, including the United States. The United States does not have any special role in the early revelations. The United States is going to be destroyed along with all the other countries, along with all the other nations at the time of Jesus' coming. And so, maybe it's special in a kind of Book of Mormon sense, and that's where the restoration takes place and so forth. But the United States as a political entity is not special. And none of the political entities are special because they're all temporary, right? When Jesus comes, they're all going to be wiped clean. And so, again, if Jesus is coming next week, next month, next year, why would you bother with politics? Why would you bother, getting a good relationship with political leaders? That's just a waste of time. All you have to do is to go out, send missionaries, save souls, and build Zion. That's what you're called to do. Politics is a distraction. That begins to change in 1833, and it begins to change in this revelation. And in fact, so it's in it's in this revelation beginning in verse 4, right? So right at the beginning of the revelation, this is Joseph Smith saying, like, "Hey, God, what are we supposed to do?" Right? Our people are getting wailed on out there in Missouri. What are we supposed to do about this? And God says, "Now verily I say concerning the laws of the land, it's my will that my people should observe to do all things whatsoever I command them." So it's interesting there. What does he say? He says, keep my commandments. He's not talking about civil law, right? Keep my commandments. An earlier revelation said, if one of the earlier revelations that talked about politics, where God says, if you keep my law, then you'll keep the other laws too. I'm paraphrasing here, right? But anybody who keeps my law will also keep the law of the land. So again, it's not special. Just keep the commandments. That's all that matters, right? Keep my law, keep my word. But then he goes on to say, and this is new, this is an innovation in Mormon theology with this revelation, that law of the land which is constitutional, supporting that principle of freedom in maintaining rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind and is justifiable before me. Therefore, I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law, which is the constitutional law of the land. So this is new, and where God says, make friends with the constitutional government, make friends with constitutional law. He still says, now remember in verse 4, he says, you should observe the things that I command you. So you're supposed to be obedient to my law, but you can make friends with the constitutional law. And when the Revelation talks about constitutional law, and ever since, when Latter-day Saints talk about the Constitution, what they really care about are its protections for minority rights and especially the protection for religious freedom, right? That's what it says, that the law of the land, which is constitutional, supporting that principle of freedom in maintaining rights and privileges. And interestingly, it says belongs to all mankind. This is universal. It's not just American, but all human beings have a right to have their rights and privileges and freedoms maintained. That's what God means here by constitutional, is some kind of governmental political apparatus. He doesn't say whether there should be 3 branches of government. He doesn't say whether there should be a lower house and an upper house. He doesn't talk about any of that. He simply says constitutional law, which protects rights and freedoms, i.e. of minorities, like the Mormons. So that's what's different here. And so as a result of this violence in Jackson County in 1833, Mormons will reach out to the governor of the state of Missouri. You wouldn't do that if Jesus is coming tomorrow. Again, the governor of the state of Missouri has no more authority than the garbage collector next door, right? But it's only when you're given permission to befriend the constitutional law of the land that Mormons start to look to political authorities, not just to God, for solutions.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and it's interesting to think of Mormons as minorities, right? Nowadays, that sort of connotates racial minorities, but yeah, it's interesting to think of Mormons being white Americans for the most part, being considered as a minority. And is that even a term that people would have used in the 1830s?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so American government democracy is based on the idea that there's going to be majorities and minorities. And in fact, James Madison and Alexis de Tocqueville and other kind of early American, the most brilliant thinkers about American democracy all talked about majorities and minorities. And they worried about the phrase that they used all the time was the tyranny of the majority. They said, so we want to create a government where the voice of the people reigns, right? That's what a democracy is, not just a king, but the voice of the people. But they recognized, I mean, they weren't idiots. They knew that not everybody was going to agree on stuff. They knew that people were divided politically, ethnically, religiously, racially, all these different ways that people were divided then, just like they are now. And they said, it simply makes sense that there's going to be a majority coalition of people, and then that's going to leave minorities. And the thing that they worried about was, what is it in democratic government? What is it in a democratic society that prevents the majority from just running roughshod over everybody else?
Yeah, and if it's been a while since I've read about this kind of stuff, but wasn't one of the things that they thought would sort of keep the majority from abusing the minority, wasn't one of the things religion? Didn't they kind of encourage religion because they believed that it would keep the majority in check?
Yeah, definitely. They believed that religion of any kind, again, they were clear they didn't want to establish one church. But they thought that religion, and when they say religion, they really mean Christianity. And when they say Christianity, they really mean Protestantism. And really, they mean like 3 or 4 different churches, but not including Mormons. But the religion that these churches would inculcate virtue. That religion was so important, was foundational to a Republican form of government, because they believed, and I think they weren't far off, that a Republican form of government, small r Republican, only works when you have a virtuous citizenry, right? And the Book of Mormon talks about this too, right? It's pretty terrible if the majority, Mosiah talks about this, right? If the voice of the people, if the majority of the people are wicked, then you've got a problem on your hands. So the founders believed that virtue was at the foundation of Republican or Democratic government. And yeah, and religion was one way that you're going to do that. And this is precisely why they built the constitutional democracy, the Republican form of government that they did. They built in all these checks and balances. That's why they created 3 branches of governments. That's why they created a federal system with the states and the federal government and all these different checks, because they didn't trust government. They didn't trust majorities. And so they wanted government to work poorly. Sometimes you say, like, why does American government not work? Why is it so slow? Why are people arguing all the time? It's because the founders built it that way, because they didn't trust majorities. They didn't, and they wanted to create a system that would encourage compromise and encourage negotiation rather than just the majority having total power all the time.
Yeah. No, it's funny you mentioned that. I remember growing up, my dad always saying, like, the government is designed not to work. And that's why, right? It's just to encourage compromise and make sure that everyone got as fair a shake as possible.
Yeah.
So we're focusing on, as our listeners know, we like to focus on specific sources in each episode. And I think we've pretty much established that this episode is focusing on section 98. And you've already touched on this a little bit, but in verses 4 through 7 of that section, just like you mentioned, the Lord, through Joseph Smith, is mentioning how the law of the land, which is constitutional, supporting that principle of freedom, maintaining the rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind and is justifiable before me. And in verse 7, it says, and as pertaining to law of man, whatsoever is more or less than this cometh of evil. And then we know that later in 1833, we get section 101, which I believe says that the Lord established the Constitution or influenced the creation of the Constitution. Is this verse sort of implying that any law that isn't deemed constitutional evil, does it, or is coming from Satan or the natural man or whatever language you want to use, and therefore can be dismissed or not adhered to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and all we have here are just like a few phrases, right? I mean, this is not a long discourse on political theory. We have just like a few sentences here. So they've been interpreted differently. But the way I read it is, that in section 98, when it says constitutional law, it defines it as the law which supports that principle of freedom in maintaining rights and privileges that belong to all mankind. Again, not just the majority, but belongs to everybody. That's how it defines constitutional law, by maintaining rights and privileges. And so anything more or less than that, it says cometh of evil, right? So so what does that mean, more or less than that? I think definitely we can think about the less than that. Any laws that don't support rights and privileges, right? In any laws that that lead to tyranny, to autocracy, that threaten fundamental rights that people have. Now, of course, then people debate what are fundamental rights. I mean, this is the world we live in. But I think that principle is clear. What does it mean by more than that? Right. I mean, so we can debate over those things, but I think that's what what is pointing to, again, that constitutional equals protecting rights and privileges.
Okay. And was there any sense of how they, I guess, interpreted that saying? Like, were they? I mean, nowadays when we think of the Constitution, well, who interprets the Constitution? It's the Supreme Court, right? Did Mormons at that time believe that principle? Did they think, okay, the Supreme Court has the final say, or was there more of a theocratic element to it? Like, did they rely on Joseph Smith to interpret laws as constitutional?
Yeah,
do you have any sense of how that worked?
It's still very much in flux. I mean, first of all, it's not super well established yet that the Supreme Court does interpret all the laws for everybody. That's actually at stake in the 1830s. There's some important Supreme Court cases that test that, and then Andrew Jackson is pushing back and so forth. So again, this is one of the things about history, is we have to recognize that things were different back then. And the United States was a young nation. some of the people who were involved here were alive during 1776, right? And let alone 1787 and the drafting of the Constitution. So the United States is still figuring all this stuff. Like, how do we decide what's constitutional? Most of the constitutional amendments don't even exist yet. After the 10 in the Bill of Rights, and so that's all still being worked out. And so Latter-day Saints also. Yes, there's always a theocratic element to it, but even that isn't fully fleshed out yet in the early 1830s. That's gonna come in more in Nauvoo. Clearly, they're anticipating the kingdom of God. Jesus is the king of the kingdom of God. We're anticipating that. That's what we're waiting for. And again, all of this other stuff. This is the first revelation that really talks about politics in any significant way, and it's only a few sentences. So they are literally the Mormon theology about the relationship of religion and politics, religion and the state. It's just starting right here. We see the kernels or the seeds where it's beginning to take shape here.
Interesting. So, let's dive in a little bit more to this section. So in verse.
Could I I'm thinking on the spot, which it can be dangerous, but I've never thought much about this less than or more than that. And in today's terms, if I'm trying to think of what could be more than that, I'm thinking that throughout the U.S. history, we have the civil rights movement, we have equal rights amendments, we have the rulings on LGBTQ issues. Are those the types of things one should be thinking of when they're thinking more than? I know you said we only have we don't have a lot of context, but
right.
Am I going the right direction with that, or do you feel it's?
I think so, and I think this is the debate. This is the debate we've had in American history ever since. Is what are fundamental rights and privileges, right? And so the civil rights movement comes along. This is why we fight the Civil War, right? That one of the fundamental rights and privileges is to not be a slave. And so then we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, especially the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment, which extends citizenship. And so I think now all Americans would say, yeah, those are fundamental rights, but it took a civil war to secure that. And then the civil rights movement to really secure the right to vote and for equal accommodations and equal treatment. Then I think women come along, beginning with the women's suffrage movement. That begins shortly after this in Seneca Falls, and then in the late 19th and early 20th century, where women say, hey, wait a minute, those fundamental rights are not just for men, they're for us too, right? The right to own property, the right to serve on juries, the right to vote, all of these kinds of things. And so that's all. And then now with LGBTQ questions, the right to marry, right? Does that belong to everybody or simply to heterosexuals? And so this has been the debate that we've had throughout American history. We're always arguing about rights and privileges. And then you've got people, saying, hey, the Second Amendment, right? My Second Amendment rights. And so if anything that the government does that might abridge my right to bear arms is a violation. So a lot of Mormon libertarians and Mormon conservatives and so forth actually point to this language and say anything that abridges my rights that are protected in the Constitution is more or less than this, and therefore is evil.
So would it make sense to presume that that's what this would be stating at the time, is that we shouldn't add or take away from our current rights as we understand them today? Or
I'm not sure that it means that. I maybe. I mean, that's an interesting reading. But I don't see the Latter-day Saints aren't opposed to amending the Constitution, partly because the Constitution allows for its own amendment, right? I mean, it's simply that constitutional law is meant to protect rights and privileges, right?
Okay.
So anything more or less than protecting rights and privileges. So I've done a study of like what if most presidents of the church and other prophets and apostles throughout time, when they talk about constitutional law, what do they mean, right? When they talk about, are they talking about Article 3, Section 4? I don't even know what that is, right? No, most of the time what they're talking about is the First Amendment right to protect, the protection of freedom of religion. The overwhelming majority of prophetic statements about constitutional rights refer to First Amendment guarantees of free exercise of religion.
Yeah, this is good stuff. So this is one of the goals of this podcast, is to kind of show Mormonism or Mormon history as sort of a case study as to what's going on generally. So this is great. So I did want to talk about part of the section in verse 16. It says, "Therefore renounce war and proclaim peace." I mean, this is what we've been talking about, right? How Mormonism at this time was largely pacifist. But then it says, "And seek diligently to turn the hearts of the children to their fathers, and the hearts of their fathers to the children." Now, in contemporary Mormonism today, that kind of language usually refers to proxy ordinances that are done in LDS temples. I don't even know if temples were on the radar for Mormons at this time. So what did this language mean exactly? How did the pacifism come out of this concept?
Yeah, so the Kirtland Temple was on the radar. So the commandment had been given to build the Kirtland Temple. It was not yet completed. That wouldn't happen for another 3 years. And so like Elijah hadn't come, so all the kind of theological meaning that will get attached to this in Mormon theology around keys and sealing and so forth, that's all way in the future. Now, this verse, it refers to a verse from Malachi that Joseph Smith said that Moroni had quoted to him when Moroni came to him a decade earlier in 1823. So these words and these concepts were certainly foundational for Joseph Smith. But yeah, you're exactly right to suggest that like this is not what we think of today, right? This is not talking about family history, and like doing your genealogy and going to baptism for the dead, because none of that exists yet. That's all in the future. Here, I think it's it is curious. Like I've always found that like the renounce war and proclaim peace, like that makes a lot of sense to me given the context, right? Given what's going on, and the whole rest of the section is going to be God giving very specific instructions on when the saints are or are not justified in using violence to defend themselves when they're attacked. So that makes a lot of sense. But you do have the second half of verse 16 and then verse 17 is like this Malachi language. And again, it's all about the second coming of Jesus, right? Lest I come and smite your whole earth with a curse when Jesus comes again. So it's in a second coming context. And there is this, again, the idea that the purpose of Mormonism, the purpose of the restoration was to unite the human family, that it was fractured in all these different ways. It was fractured generationally, it was fractured religiously. And so I think, at least the way that I read these verses is that, yes, you've got a problem on your hands, saints, right? You're receiving violence in Jackson County, and you got to figure that out. And I'm going to give you some advice about that. But don't take your eyes off the ball of what the bigger project is here. And the bigger project of the restoration is to create these welding links between the generations and between Jews and Gentiles and Lamanites, like the Book of Mormon talks about. So I think it's saying to, even in the proximate issues of the violence in Jackson County, the Revelation still wants them to put it into a bigger picture of what the restoration project is meant to be.
Yeah, and could it be interpreted as saying that, as you mentioned later on in the section, it talks about how to respond to violence, and it's largely through, turning the other cheek, right?
Yeah.
So could it be that this is saying that by turning the other cheek, you are accomplishing that goal of bringing the world together, connecting families? Could it be interpreted that way? Was it?
I think definitely, especially because of what the Revelation goes on to say. I mean, so, oftentimes, texts interpret themselves. And so it, in verse 16, it's talking about the hearts of the children to their fathers and the fathers to the children. And if you skip down several verses, in verses 28, 29, 30, it's talking about, okay, when people attack you, you should bear it patiently, revile not against them. This is verse 23. You bear it patiently, you'll receive a greater reward. And then it talks about the more that you revile not against your enemy and bear it patiently, your reward will increase exponentially. It does say now at a certain point, right, if you just can't take it anymore, right, and if you've offered an ensign of peace, if you have reviled not, if you've done all these things, if you issue a warning against your enemy, then you can be justified in defending yourself. And I think actually that word justified, it's consistent here, and I think it means a lot theologically. If you want to talk about that, we can. But it goes on to say that if you do, if you decide basically to proclaim peace as it commands to do, then it says that in verse 30, if you will spare him, thou shalt be rewarded for thy righteousness, and also thy children and thy children's children unto the third and fourth generation. So peace and peacemaking, proclaiming peace, has an intergenerational quality to it. And so does violence, by the way. So the section talks about, the Revelation talks about the same thing, right? That you can get locked into an intergenerational cycle of conflict and an intergenerational cycle of violence. And we see this happen all the time, right? Where generations of people fight each other over things that happened decades or centuries earlier. Well, the Lord is saying the same thing is true of peace as well. If you choose to engage peacefully, then that has a kind of multi-generational dynamic. So yeah, I think you're really smart, John, to kind of connect that to what's going on in verse 16 as well.
Oh,
Patrick, let's slow down. Let's not make his head too big tonight. No, I just wanted to kind of point out too, when you talk about the justify, that it's repeated that it's in defense. It seems that if they seek your life and if your life is in their hands, then thou art justified. Not just if you've just had enough, then you're justified to get revenge. But if more of a self-defense perspective is how I interpret that.
Absolutely. So it's very clear here that it's only in self-defense. It's not like, hey, you don't like those people, or those people are settling in lands in Jackson County that you really like. Hey, why don't you go get rid of them using violence, right? It is only in self-defense, and it's only after, in the first time, it says you have to bear it patiently, right? So you don't get to be preemptive. You don't get to use violence, and you have to bear it patiently. This is the Christian ethic. And then it says, yeah, then after multiple offenses, right? If they keep coming back, if you bear it patiently, if you turn the other cheek, if you're merciful, and they keep attacking and keep attacking and keep attacking, then it says you can be justified in essentially responding in self-defense. And I'll just say very quickly what I think the Revelation means there theologically. So the word justification, if in the writings of Paul, especially in the book of Rome, in the epistle to the Romans, to justify something theologically means to make it right. It's basically thinking about a court of law, where you can, somebody has done something wrong, but a judge can make it right. It can be justified in the eyes of the law. It doesn't mean that action is holy. It doesn't mean that it was righteous. It means that actually the action was wrong. It was less than ideal, but it can be justified. And Paul talks about how we're all justified by Jesus, right? By his grace and by his atonement. And so that's the same concept that's going on here. It's very clear that it's better. The preferred option is to not respond violently. The better option is to bear it patiently, to not revile against them. But it says you can be justified under this very strict criteria that self-defensive violence can be made right. It can be excused, might be the better word for it, that God will excuse it, but still there's a better option to choose not to. And in fact, it talks about your rewards will be much better if you choose not to respond with violence.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So we've kind of dived into this a little bit, where the Revelation goes through, like you said, first time bear it patiently. Second time, same thing. Third time, even the same thing. And then I think it's the fourth time where you're finally justified, right?
Yeah.
Was that, how did the saints take that at the time? Was it, how formalized was it? Was there somebody like keeping a tally
right.
of all the times that people were getting offended? How was that interpreted?
It's a great question. We don't know for sure. This is where the record is a little bit fragmentary. Some scholars have gone back and applied this to them and have done that tallying for them, right?
Yeah.
To say, look, okay, once, twice, three, and yeah, on the fourth time, then that's when they responded. I'm not sure. It was, yeah, I don't think anybody had a chalkboard and was keeping count at the time. Clearly they took seriously the spirit of this, right? So how much were they like counting? That's a little bit unclear, but they clearly were responding to the spirit of this. But I mean, this will fast forward, and you'll probably have other episodes about this as well. There's later revelations that come along and that associated with the formation of what comes to be known as Zion's camp, right? And so they do decide to take up arms in self-defense. I have a lot more to say about that too, but you can save that for another episode.
Yeah, sequel episode for sure. Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. Just the spirit of that, I think, is fascinating. And I know that there were other pacifist movements going on throughout the country at the time. Can you say something about those, whether they were religious or not?
Yeah, there are some. There are a handful of religious groups that are committed to nonviolence at the time. The Quakers are famously committed to nonviolence. A few other very small, what we call peace churches. A lot of them come from Germany, from what we call the Anabaptist tradition. And this goes way back to the 16th century, in which they refused to participate in the military. Of course, the earliest Christians were committed to pacifism until basically until the conversion of Constantine. So basically, the first 300 years of Christianity, Christianity was basically a pacifist religion. So, but yeah, in early America at this time, there would have been a handful of religious groups that were committed to peace, and you have the very early beginnings of a secular peace movement as well, some peace societies and things like that. It'll really take a few more decades for them to kind of take shape. But you do see this in a few different places. Some of the abolitionists are also pacifists as well. Again, the abolitionists are just like radical. I mean, they think women should vote. I mean, they believe in all kinds of radical things, right? But some of the abolitionists are pacifists also.
Okay, interesting. Well, one of the things that this brings to my mind is a statement over 100 years later from another church leader, President David O. McKay. And I believe that it was him that said this in like 1942, I think. But he essentially said that there were times when a nation is justified, and again, we're using that word, in going to war. And one was to protect someone else, or another nation, or themselves, or whatever. But the first was to when another country is attempting to dominate and to deprive another of their agency. The second one was just to show loyalty to your country. And then there was sort of a soft third, which was defense of a weak nation that is being unjustly crushed by a strong and ruthless one. And, at the time, 1942, I think, World War II is, we're in the thick of it. But how do you think we went from, and this is a huge topic, but how does Section 98 relate to David O. McKay's declaration?
Right. That's a great question, and I think it's the question. It's the important question, because you're right. Yeah. So that 1942 statement by the first presidency puts us in. It cites Section 98. It actually takes 98 very seriously, but it leans and it says that war is terrible, war is horrible. Actually, J. Reuben Clark was a counselor in the first presidency, and he was basically pacifist. But he's the one who wrote that statement. So you have under the direction of President McKay, but it's also in the context of World War II, right, with Nazis, and so I mean these issues are extraordinarily complex. Basically, it's I argue in some things that I've written that I think this revelation begins to open the door to that. There's a statement by the church 2 years later that we have as section 135 of the Doctrine and Covenants is a declaration regarding governments that probably all of our Calvary writes. We don't know 100% sure. It's not a revelation. It's a declaration of the church that's written by church members, adopted by a church council in Kirtland. Joseph Smith isn't there when they write it, but he comes back and he says, yeah, that's good, puts his stamp of approval on it. It's in the Doctrine and Covenants now. It also says that the Latter-day Saints basically owe an obligation to be good citizens and to honor their governments and honor the laws of the land. And then I think for, I could say a lot about this, but I think really the turning point for all of this comes at the end of the 19th century, after Mormonism has tried its hand at theocracy, has been in conflict with the federal government for decades, mostly over polygamy. And in the last decade of the 19th century, basically the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints makes a deal that says we're going to be good citizens, right? We're going to give up our resistance. We're going to give up the fight in terms of theocracy and polygamy and what it means to be a Latter-day Saint. They'll point back to some of these revelations and say, we obey the constitutional law of the land. And that includes going to war when the nation goes to war. So it's a long transition from 1833 to 1942. But I think the seeds of what we see is eventually bear fruit in 1942 are planted here in Section 98.
Interesting. So not that the 1942 statement is like a declaration of be violent all the time.
No, not at all.
But it is kind of interesting that 98, Section 98 is it leans heavy toward pacifism, right? And then fast forward to 1942. It's like, okay, no, war is justified, and it seems to me that it becomes more and more justified as the years go on. If that makes sense.
Clearly, I think in the Cold War, the church and church leaders very much support, America and American military action. It's all about being good citizens. It's about being accepted in the country, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's arguably what defines a state is its ability to control violence and to do violence. Right. And so to be a good citizen means to fight for your country. And minorities have always done this in this country. Like one of the ways that they gain status, one of the ways that they show, hey, we're just like you and you should like us, is to fight in the military. African Americans have done this, Jews have done this, Catholics have done it, Mormons have done it. It's one of the ways that you show that you're just part of society. And again, I don't think it's beginning in 1833 and then going to 1942 or President Hinckley's talk in 2003 after 9/11 and in the context of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's not like the needle switches where Mormonism goes from like a pacifist tradition to like being out there like doing crusades and stuff like that, right? I mean, President Hinckley cites Section 98. President McKay, the first presidency. So this is a foundational document. It's just a matter of like the needle sort of shifting, with the emphasis being, I think in 98, as you said, I think the emphasis is more towards nonviolence. Yeah. The emphasis after the 1890s and in 1942 and in 2003, the emphasis moves a little bit more in the just war. And of course, this isn't the only text. We also have the Book of Mormon. So people look at Captain Moroni and all of those different texts. I have lots to say about Captain Moroni, but we'll just focus on Section 98 right now.
Yeah. I just think it's fascinating because I do think Section 98, it could have set them down a completely different path, right?
Yeah.
Where it becomes more and more pacifist, but instead they went the other way. So Very
well, and I have to say, and this is just a bit of a plug for my most recent book, Proclaim Peace. So my co-author David Pulsar and I, we we think as we look at restoration scripture, and it's a bit more of a theological book than a strictly historical book, but we think section 98 is the gold standard for what restoration scripture, along with the Sermon on the Mount, in terms of what the restoration says about Latter-day Saints participation in violence. And so we think that the needle maybe is moved a little in one direction, and we argue that maybe the needle should come back to what section 98 actually says.
Interesting. Well, so one of the things we like to do on this podcast is talk about sort of the legacy of these sources, and so I think we've touched on that quite a bit with section 98, that the legacy of this is like you said, it starts the church down this path towards justifying violence in some cases. Do you want to add anything else to that? Like, what else would you say is involved in the legacy of this section?
Yeah, well, I think that the two things that we've talked about, one is its legacy of engagement with constitutional government and talking about rights and privileges, right? So everybody comes back to this section to talk about it. I mean, so you see those verses 4-7 cited all the time whenever Mormons talk about politics, and so it's foundational. And it's partly because it's so vague about what it actually means. Vague texts are always the most useful texts to the greatest number of people, because they can be interpreted in so many different ways. So definitely foundational for Latter-day Saint political theology or political theory, and so far as there is one. And then informing how Latter-day Saints think about violence. And I have to say, again, what David Pulsar and I were trying to do in Proclaim Peace is to get people back to section 98, like to actually read it again, rather than to simply assume that whenever the nation says go to war, we just go to war. That maybe section 98 is worth revisiting and taking a little more seriously than we have. And I do have to say, other scholars interpret section 98 differently than I do. And that's okay. We can have that discussion. We can have that debate. But I do think it's a foundational document, especially, we live in a world of violence. Think about the war in Ukraine. Think about, all these kinds of things. And so even though most Latter-day Saints live in places where they're secure and where they're safe and so forth, I think it's worth, as we think about our role in society, our role in governments, section 98, I think, is a really foundational document that should inform how we think about all those things. Great.
Thank you. We also want to give you the chance. Like I said, we want to boost your career a little bit. What are you working on now? What can we look forward to?
So I'm working on a couple of different projects, historical projects. One, I'm co-editing a volume of essays about radicalism in the Mormon tradition. So that's economic radicalism, political radicalism. I'm writing an essay on nonviolence. Surprise, surprise. So all different kinds of ways that the Mormonism is intersected with radicalism, defined in different ways. So that's one project. And then I'm also, I've been doing research on this for a long time, and I'm committed to finally finishing a book about Ezra Taft Benson. And his life and thought about both his religious and political thought.
Oh, great. Yeah, I remember you talking about the Ezra Taft Benson biography.
Yeah, I've been talking about it for way too long, so now it's time to actually do it.
No, I think that'll be fantastic when that comes out. I'm looking forward to that.
Thanks.
Well, thanks so much again for doing this for us. I know you've had a busy day, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely, my pleasure.
This has been excellent. I think it's been awesome to cover the section 98 leading up to 1833. I think astute listeners are going to wonder, well, what happened after that? And that's a fair question, but it's not this discussion. So thank you so much, Patrick, for covering this. And hopefully we can, hopefully we'll be around long enough to talk about what happened after this, because that's an interesting story that is not to be glazed over. So, but
Yeah,
this has been great and very insightful. So thanks so much, Patrick. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thanks, guys. My pleasure.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back sometime. Obviously, we have a very long running podcast here. Can't disappoint our listeners. So
We'll see
anyway,
if John's internet ever works again.
yeah.
No.
Yeah, it was kind of a rough go at first, but anyway,
Well,
thanks for bearing with us.
You
Yeah,
bet.
we appreciate it. Thank you. And I guess we'll catch everyone on the other side. Life's rough. Roll on. Good job, John. You're still on.
Yeah,
Let's hear what you have for the end of the song, John.
What?